Welcome to the McGill Faculty of Law, inspiring legal leadership for global challenges. Fièrement enraciné à Montréal, nous rayonnons de le monde. I'm Robert Leckie, the Dean of the Faculty, and I welcome you this evening on behalf of the faculty and on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. For some of you, this may be a welcome back after a long period without intellectual activity in our buildings that's open to the public. We've been teaching in person since late August 2021, but the return to in-person events open to the broader public has been a gradual one. This event was initially scheduled for March 2020, and we were all convinced that this was not one to do on Zoom, and I'm so pleased we're here together this evening. Vous êtes venus ou revenus à une faculté de droit qui est située sur le territoire traditionnel du peuple Ganagahaga. Quant à elle, l'île appelée Montréal a longtemps servi à titre de lieu de rencontre et d'échange d'autres nations autochtones, y compris les Algonquins. Par ailleurs, le ménage de notre bienfaiteur fondateur, James McGill, a compté au moins 5 personnes vivant en esclavage. Jack, Sarah et Marie-Louise étaient noirs et Marie Potamian était autochtone. Il y avait aussi un garçon autochtone dont nous ignorons le nom. Il y a un projet de recherche en cours qui vise d'approfondir nos connaissances des rapports historiques entre notre université, le colonialisme de peuplement et l'esclavage. I wish at the outset to recognize those associated with the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, who are our hosts and organizers of today's events. We have the co-directors of the center, Professors Nandini Ramanujam and Frédéric Maigret, Sharon Webb, the center's extraordinarily gifted and effective coordinator, Shona Moreau, student coordinator, and Professor Darren Rosenblum, who earlier this afternoon hosted the Martine Roy Student Colloquium. And I add a shout out to Martine Roy. Martine, there she is. Yes. And the 4 McGill law students who presented brilliant and provocative papers on matters ranging from sexual privacy on dating apps to what responses to the AIDS crisis can teach us about COVID-19. Seth Gordon, Linnea Kornhauser, Andy Huang-Lafranc, and Raphael Schmieder-Gropen. And I can add that while it was a close race, Andy received the prize for best paper. Congratulations to the 4 students. I'm delighted to extend a special welcome to colleagues associated with IMK Advocates, including Maître Douglas Mitchell, BCL 88, LOB 88, Doug is the M in IMK, and Maître Audrey Bochter, BCL LOB 05. IMK has many ties with the Faculty of Law. A substantial number of its talented litigators are members of our alumni community, and several are actively involved in teaching and contributing otherwise to our students' professional development and success. I'm about to turn over the microphone to Audrey Bochter. Audrey is a former clerk to Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin of the Supreme Court of Canada and a past president of the Canadian Bar Association, Quebec Division. She's a highly respected litigator who pleads regularly at every level of court. And I won't list all her cases, but for the audience tonight, 2 are especially relevant. So first, Audrey was lead counsel to the Quebec class members in the Lgbt Purge class action against the Government of Canada for systemic discrimination against LGBT members of the military, RCMP, and public service. And second, she continues to do so, as the lead pro bono counsel to the Center for Gender Advocacy and named plaintiffs in a major constitutional challenge to Quebec laws regarding the rights of trans and non-binary people. In 2020, Audrey was listed as one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada by Canadian Lawyer and was named Woman of the Year at the Canadian Law Awards. In 2021, she received the Canadian Bar Association SOGIC Ally Award for her work in public interest litigation, advancing equality for LGBTQ2+ people in Canada. Audrey Bochter.
Thank you very much. It's a huge honor to be here on behalf of IMK to introduce the Michelle Douglas Lecture held today for the first time in conjunction with the Martine Roy Student Colloquium. This lecture and colloquium will take place every 2 years. So this is the inaugural event, but will not be the last. It's an event that we look forward to supporting and participating in for years to come. Being able to help bring the Purge class action to a successful resolution was an enormous honor for our firm. For me personally, for my colleagues Jean-Michel, Olga, Manon, who worked on the file, and really for our entire firm who supported the file from the outset. The legal profession has its ups and downs, but one of the greatest privileges of being an advocate is being entrusted with telling someone's story. Through legal action, one person or a few people's stories can serve to tell the stories of thousands of others. We help move things along, but it's the heroes of the story who, through pain, sacrifice, and courage, change things for everyone. Through this lectureship, IMK wanted to not only honor Michelle, and through the colloquium Martine, but also to help build a space where community members, allies, students, activists, and academics could all come together to keep learning, working, advocating, and making change happen on issues affecting the LGBTQ+ communities. We can't think of a better space than the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism here at McGill. Having had a chance to attend the student colloquium today, I can say without a doubt that the future looks very bright. We're so grateful to Dean Leckie, to Nandini Ramunujan, and everyone at the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and the broader law faculty for all the work invested in making this happen. I couldn't possibly name everyone because I know there are just so many people involved in making this event a success. Mostly, thank you, Michelle and Martine.
Thank you, Audrey. I really want to say just how pleased I am that IMK made the donations to endow the permanent funding for the Michelle Douglas Lecture and Martine Roy Colloquium. Around about the same time, a group of alumni were fundraising to create the Everett Clippert Scholarship, which is awarded each year to an outstanding undergraduate or graduate student entering the Faculty of Law. Preference is given to students having demonstrated a commitment to working on issues facing marginalized members of LGBT communities. And so the Faculty of Law, like McGill University more broadly, is working hard to advance inclusion and foster the flourishing of members of groups for whom the university hasn't always been a welcoming or a safe space. And I want to say this evening how proud I am that initiatives related to our LGBTQ+ communities figure among them. And so now it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Michelle Douglas. Michelle had a 30-year career as a public servant, retiring in 2019 from the position of Director of International Relations at the Canadian Department of Justice. In that role, she represented Canada at international meetings of the Commonwealth, Organization of American States, and the G7. And that alone might merit Michelle a speaking invitation to the McGill Faculty of Law. But much more pertinent for this evening's purposes, Michelle served as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces from 1986 to 89 and was honorably discharged from the military in 1989 under the military's LGBT Purge. And we'll hear about it more shortly directly from her, but she's had a 30-year-long record of advancing social justice and human rights activism, beginning, if I'm not mistaken, in 1992 with a landmark legal challenge against the military's discriminatory policies against LGBT service members. Michelle has served on a number of boards for not-for-profit organizations, including the Michael Jean Foundation. She was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. And speaking more personally, I've been trying to get Michelle to the Faculty of Law to speak to our community here for several years. Despite her path-breaking achievements and inspirational record, Michelle is modest, and it took a couple of calls before I could persuade her that her journey would be precisely the right subject for this evening's lecture. Late last fall, when the Omicron clouds were gathering, I had the great pleasure of sitting down with her in my office over sandwiches, and I was impressed by her commitment to upcoming generations of LGBTQ students and others. So I'm confident that while this is Michelle Douglas's first time speaking publicly at the McGill Faculty of Law, it will not be her last. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Douglas.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. What a great honor it is for me to join with all of you this evening, and to those of you who are watching on the video link. This is a long time in coming, as you've mentioned, but I'm so glad that we could all be here in person. I want to start by thanking Dean Leckie for your personal kindness, to the faculty I had the chance to meet with, and really to the students who just so warmly welcomed me here. A special thanks to the lovely Professor Nandini Ramunujan, who who just connected with me, and I think we had a really lovely conversation today. So also thank you to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. You know, it's hard when you might be seen to peak at 23 years old with something you'll be known for the rest of your life. But tonight is actually a life highlight for me, and it's an honor so special, one I never could have imagined. So I'm going to deliver these remarks with a mixture of humility and pride also at this wonderful place of learning and scholarship. Of course, I would like to thank the IMK Advocates law firm who conceived of and have financially supported this lectureship, and also the Martine Roy Colloquium. What an honor for me personally, but it's really in imagining the future possibilities that really excites me and thrills me and imagines, you know, the big, bold ideas that will be expressed, the insights, and I hope also the hope that would come from such a series in the future. A moment of personal indulgence here to express my personal gratitude to Audrey Bochter. You've heard her professional accomplishments, but it's her empathy, her caring, her standing up and showing up for survivors of the LGBT Purge class action that have really deeply touched me. And so I'm particularly delighted to have her be part of this as well. Finally, by way of introduction, I'd like to dedicate tonight's lecture to all of the lawyers who supported LGBT Purge survivors, and to LGBT Purge survivors and their families who've struggled mightily but have received some form of justice. So this is a fundamentally personal story, but it's also a story that was shared by thousands of people. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what happened in my legal challenge that happened in the early 1990s, and we'll evolve from that. I'll reflect on a few other points. And I hope you'll also gain an understanding of what is really a shameful period of time in Canadian history, a history not well known, one we now call the LGBT Purge. I'm also going to do my best to show you a few images from the past, and we'll see how that goes as well. I was a pretty mediocre student, but after graduating from university, I went to Carleton University, where I majored in law. I really wanted to be a police officer, and so I thought, you know, maybe I'll apply to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, some municipal forces. Oh yes, the Canadian Armed Forces also has a military police. I'll apply there as well. So that was 1986. I went to the recruiting station, and lo and behold, the Canadian Armed Forces called me back first. So I signed up and was actually really proud to serve my country in that way. It turns out that service is a life pillar for me that has evolved in ways I never expected. So let me pick it up and tell you what happened when I joined the Canadian Armed Forces. So I told you I was a mediocre student, but I got very ready to join the military. I did chin-ups, I did push-ups, I got into shape, I was really ready to serve. By the way, those chin-ups came in handy for me in my earliest days. When I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, this was 1986. So let me also pause, especially to the law students and others here, and just underline for you a broader context, and that is what was happening in Canada at that time. 1986, right? So it's a year into the operation of Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, I started to excel. Surprisingly, actually, I thought I would kind of maybe struggle in the military, but it turns out we were a good fit. I could do chin-ups, push-ups, and it turned out that when I was pursuing my class studies, I graduated at the top of every military course I ever took. Why is that important? Not for bragging rights, but I'll tell you later. So at the same time, I think it's important for you to understand what the policy was regarding LGBT people by 1986, 1987. It had evolved from an outright ban, to a policy that said, if you're gay, you can stay. But there are a few conditions. No pay raise. No promotions, no training, no postings. But if you want to serve your country under those conditions, you're welcome to remain. Oh, and there was also an obligation to report people you suspected of being gay. So, incredible. That was what was happening in the midst of my service. It was also during this time that I really fell in love for the first time with a fellow officer, and she was wonderful. Now, to recognize my achievements in the military so far, I was told that I would be posted to a unit known as the Special Investigations Unit. What did they do? Okay. They investigated the most serious forms of criminality: espionage, sabotage, subversion, allegations of homosexuality. You see, it turns out that the career folks who were acknowledging me, in fact, I was only the second female officer ever to be posted to that unit, those people who said, right, this person can go far in the Canadian Armed Forces, moved me into that unit, while at the same time I would soon become an investigation target by the very unit I was working for. One day, my boss came to see me. I was very new in this Special Investigations Unit, posted to CFB Toronto. And my boss came and said, we have an important investigation to conduct. Gather your things. We're traveling from Toronto to Ottawa. I was nervous. My family lives in Ottawa. I thought maybe I could see them. I gathered an empty briefcase. I didn't know much yet. I barely had anything in my drawers in my office. We headed out towards the airport on my way to fly to Ottawa for this investigation I didn't know anything about. And just as we were about to go to the airport, on the airport strip, my boss in the undercover K car turned in to the hotel strip, pulled into a parking lot. He said, get out, follow me. We went up to the 8th floor of what then was known as the Constellation Hotel. I spent the next 2 days there being interrogated about my sexual orientation. These were tough times. I can place myself back there very quickly. It was pretty awful. 2 men, military police officers, interrogating me about my sexual orientation. Now, I told you I'd fallen in love with another woman, but did I have an LGBT identity? Not really. I just know I loved this person. And so I didn't have community politics. I didn't really associate identity with it, but I knew I had to be careful and hidden about my orientation, lest I be thrown out of the military or subjected to a policy which, frankly, I didn't know much about at that time either. So I denied it. I denied it for a long time. And they said, well, that's fine. There's really only one way to prove it. You'll have to take a polygraph exam. I said, there's no way I'll take that. No way. Well, I was subjected to ongoing harassment when I returned to the office that was pretty intense. Scarring, really. And ultimately, I said, yes, I will take your polygraph exam. I was flown to Ottawa shortly thereafter, and while I was strapped to a polygraph exam, I came out to them and said, yes, I'm gay. And that moment changed my life. Then, of course, they didn't stop there. They were demanding to know who else I knew to be gay in the Canadian Armed Forces. And when I wouldn't tell them, they declared that my loyalty to the gay community was greater than to my country. That's not true. During this period, they also forced me, with 24 hours notice, to come out to my family. They said if I didn't do it, that they'd do it for me. So the good news is my family is loving and supportive and embraced me. They did not reject me, which is the story of many I know. But I'm hoping that they're watching tonight too, so I'm sending my love right back to you. This was really the beginning of the end of my career in the Canadian Armed Forces. Remember, I told you I had graduated at the top of every course I ever took in the military. That's me. Receiving the top candidate award images from my basic security officers training course. After that experience, I was marginalized. They didn't quite know what to do with me, but the clock was running out for me. And in 1989, after about 3 years of service, I was dismissed from the Canadian Armed Forces as being not advantageously employable due to homosexuality. So let me just say that again, because it is quite a striking line. Not advantageously employable due to homosexuality. This was Canadian policy. This was written down. This was codified discrimination. It did not matter how well you performed. It only mattered that you were LGBT and you were ultimately out. Despite this rhetorical idea, or even a policy that if you're gay, you can stay, it didn't really much matter. They found a way to get you out. So I was fired in 1989. Recall Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I had occasion to go to a lecture and hear Canada's first openly gay member of Parliament, Sven Robinson. That's a picture of the two of us right there. Sven was giving a lecture talking about what it was like to be an openly gay member of Parliament. And at the end of the lecture, I stood in the lineup that forms often and waited to talk to him and said, I'm in real trouble. I'm about to get kicked out of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm on my way out. I'm lost. I think I was in shock, to be honest with you. And I don't know what to do. And he said, I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for a case like yours. Call me. So eventually we connected. And he said, I'll take you to see a lawyer. And he did. And he helped me connect with my lawyer, Clayton Ruby, and Harriet Sachs, later Justice Harriet Sachs. While I was sitting in the office of this lawyer, overwhelmed, not sure, what do you do? Like, I don't know anything about taking on the Canadian Armed Forces in a lawsuit. And he asked me the very direct question, what are you going to do? Are you going to sue them? Let's go for it. You have a great case. What will it be, yes or no? And I remember being so unsure what word would come out of my mouth. I didn't feel very courageous at the moment, I can tell you that. I felt scared and overwhelmed and unsure. And I said, sure, as long as I can do this anonymously. You see, I wasn't really out. I told you, I was trying to catch up to this identity everyone else was ready to assign to me. But he said, no, it's, lawsuits aren't anonymous. I learned that very quickly. But we'll support you along the way. And since I'm here, I think I'll just pause on that point to say they showed me real kindness. they wrapped their arms around me. They knew there was real fragility in how I was experiencing everything. So they also said, you know, the media is going to start calling you. You should prepare yourself. And I did speak to a Toronto Star reporter by the name of Michelle Landsberg. Many of you will know this name. She's an important Canadian figure in journalism, a feminist, and someone who wrote about me for the first time. And I said to her, I can't use my name, right? Like, you're not going to use my name. And she said, of course you would ask that. And I'm going to make an exception because I see what you're going through. And she kindly wrote about me under the pseudonym Miriam X. Her kindness was another measure that allowed me to keep going. Here were some of the headlines that appeared. Hers is Michelle Landsberg is entitled, "This is Military Intelligence?" Sacked lesbian suing forces. That's one of my faves. Now, at the same time we launched the lawsuit, what was the government doing? Panicking, big time. And I'm going to read from you a letter that we have recently had access to that was written in the summer of 1992 by Marcel Masse. He was the defense minister at the time, and he wrote to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Now, this letter is really interesting, and I have a copy of it, but I'm going to highlight a couple pieces for you. This is a copy of the actual letter. Marcel Masse writes to the Prime Minister, "If we proceed to try the Douglas case, there will be 3 unavoidable consequences. A, we will be perceived as refusing to acknowledge the existing law of Canada. This may well result in the award of punitive and exemplary damages. B, the Canadian Forces' reputation will be brought into disrepute. And C, the evidence generated at trial will seriously embarrass the government. I urge you, give your immediate approval to settle the Douglas case and the other pending sexual orientation cases and to abandon the current Canadian Forces policy with respect to sexual orientation in accordance with the advice and recommendations previously provided by the Attorney General of Canada." Well, how about that? So, in October of 1992, you'll note that this is the 30th anniversary of that decision, the government decided ultimately that they would lose, and they settled out of court. The military's codified policy of discrimination ended then and there. Now, what did that case do? Well, it was important for me, that's for darn sure. It also gave me a personal settlement, but it restored the rank and pay, and I think dignity, of all of those people who remained in the Canadian Armed Forces, experiencing that policy, still willing to serve. It restored their dignity, and they righted those wrongs. Now, in the years since my groundbreaking lawsuit, I've worked with many folks, and we've intervened in other cases, and I started to find my footing as a legal activist, trying to look to the courts for justice that wasn't to be found anywhere else. I became an intervener with others in cases such as M versus H, both at the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court of Canada, the Delwyn-Vriend case, and of course, equal marriage cases. As an aside, and you heard this in my introduction, at the same time, and maybe we can save this for another time, but I was also, ironically, working again for the Government of Canada. You should have seen the size of my conflict of interest declaration with them. Now, justice for one really isn't justice at all. I had some form of justice back in 1992. And I didn't really know that there was anybody else who experienced what I did back then, but I came to learn it. And I learned about it in, I think, such a sad and heartbreaking way. I realized that there were thousands of people who went through what I did. So I'm going to fast forward now to 2015, when the political conditions in Canada, that's a euphemism for the election of Justin Trudeau, became more favorable to the launching of a class action lawsuit to seek justice for all of the Purge survivors. Here I especially again acknowledge my friend Martine Roy, Alita Sitalik, and Todd Ross, who became the representative plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit and were represented by law firms IMK Advocates, Cambridge LLP, Koski Minsky, and McKigan Hebert. Finally, we got to bring an entire class together to allow the courts, or really the law in its broadest sense, to be the final nudge of pressure that had been building for decades. If you think about it, it was really this time when labor, academics, activists, courageous politicians, allies, progressive religious leaders all came together. The groundwork was laid, and their resilience and resistance for change was manifesting. It's about this critical mass coming together, the right ingredients, squeezing into this crucible at that time. And of course, it has to be said that big change doesn't happen with just one form of pressure. It takes these many, many sustained pressure points for this kind of change to happen. And this is the idea of activism, this coming together with disparate areas, forming this kind of pressure, bringing the strengths that you have, seizing the moment and taking action. And ultimately, in 2017, November 2017, so 5 years ago, we have Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons delivering an apology to the LGBTQ2+ community. He said these words: "It is our collective shame that Canadians who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or two-spirit were unjustly treated, fired from jobs, denied promotions, surveilled, arrested, convicted, and vindictively shamed because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. People lost their livelihoods, their families, and some, their lives. Today, we offer a long overdue apology to all those whom we, the Government of Canada, wronged. We are sorry. We hope by acknowledging our failings, we can make the crucial progress LGBTQ2+ people in Canada deserve." He goes on briefly to say, "We will continue to support each other in our fight for equality because we know that Canada gets stronger every single day that we choose to embrace diversity." And with that, we also had, closely following, the settlement of the class action lawsuit. The settlement of the LGBT Purge class action lawsuit is a landmark settlement. There's nothing ever been like it anywhere in the world. The total settlement was $145 million, an amount not seen anywhere. And this gave justice to the thousands of those who experienced the purge. As my friend Douglas Elliott says, and he's right about this, Sometimes justice delayed is still justice. And who are we talking about? The people just like me, LGBT Purge survivors, to those whom I've dedicated tonight's lecture. Who are they? Well, we think between the 1950s and the 1990s, during this period of the LGBT Purge, we think some 9,000 people in the Federal Public Service, RCMP, and Canadian Armed Forces experienced this kind of discrimination. Today, in that class action lawsuit, there are approximately 720 members of the class. So there they are, maybe about 1,000 or so, it's hard to know for sure, living purge survivors. This lawsuit, of course, delivered to them some measure of justice, but they can never be made whole for what they went through. The trauma that they live with is real. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights called the LGBT Purge the longest running and largest scale violation of the human rights of any workforce in Canadian history. I think I have to say that again. That's pretty powerful. The longest running and largest scale violation of the human rights of any workforce in Canadian history. From the 1950s to the 1990s, we know these thousands of people had their careers stymied or terminated because their sexual orientation or gender identity was considered a threat to the country that they had chosen to serve. During the Cold War, this discriminatory process was often justified on the grounds of national security risks, never proven, by the way, absolutely not, given their purported character weaknesses and susceptibility to blackmail by foreign agents. I told you I had to come out to my family on 24 hours notice because they used that assertion against me, saying, if you don't come out to your family immediately, you could be subjected to blackmail. Of course, this was all done despite any evidence that such coercion had ever occurred. I'm just going to, since I've dedicated tonight's lecture to some of these folks, I'd like to show you a few pictures that tell you a story about who they are. This photo was taken in the foyer of the Supreme Court of Canada, of course the federal courtroom located within that building, where we had the approval of the class action settlement. You see some of the purge survivors there. You'll note that many of them identify as women. Sadly, we have lost so many men who experienced the purge. We lost them to HIV/AIDS, we lost them to shame, to suicide, and many went back in the closet. So here we are, this fine group of Canadians who just wanted to serve their country, but they're finding their courage even in the midst of trauma. I never expected to live the kind of life that would lead me here. Never. I didn't expect to leave this kind of mark. But injustice and discrimination can happen to anyone at any time. Everyone needs to watch out for it and speak out against it. Thankfully, the practice of law has an incredibly high professional integrity and practitioners, and the court remained independent and committed to upholding the rule of law. We need that now more than ever. We need to uphold these values and principles. I believe that We, all of us gathered here tonight, our allies, our friends, are all part, collectively, of bending that arc of the moral universe in the right direction. And if people say, I'm a dreamer for wishing it, I know I'm not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so now we invite people with questions to go to one or the other of the two standing mics. Sharon, will you show if there's something coming through remotely? We'll get it over there. Okay.
Is there anything coming to the chat? For the live stream?
Oh, we don't have the chat. Okay, yes. Yeah.
First, thanks a lot on behalf of the Centre as well for this quite extraordinary presentation and sharing that story with us. I had a couple of questions, small questions really, but one is, so the emphasis was obviously on the armed forces and anti-LGBT policies have existed in a lot of armed forces. Then at one point you mentioned that actually the policy covered the entire civil service. Right? And so I was kind of intrigued. I mean, maybe you could tell us more about the origins of the policy and how it was justified at the time. I mean, was sort of homophobia mixed with security concerns, or what was exactly how was it framed? And then the second is maybe a minor point, but you mentioned that you had to sign a really long conflict of interest declaration when you started working for justice. On some level I could see why, but actually I wanted to maybe hear more about that and what was the nature of a conflict of interest? I mean, apart from the fact that you'd been involved in a particular case that they wanted you to have signed, and how did your experience as a litigant, affect your experience working for justice?
Thank you. I'll do my best with that. The history of the purge is something we're still learning about. We are undertaking now, as part of our work following the settlement of the class action through the work of the LGBT Purge Fund, which I have the honor to lead as its executive director, we're recovering historical documents to try and help understand where this policy came from, what its origins were. But we have a pretty good idea of where to look, and that is south of our borders. We know that in the era of McCarthyism, the kind of Red Scare and the Cold War, there was an elevation of concern around security clearances and so on. And also, there were events in Canada that amplified that. For example, the Igor Gazenko affair in Canada. And so the idea of reliability to your nation became under particular scrutiny. And ultimately, there was a heightened security awareness and looking for vulnerabilities. But of course, particularly in the government, they didn't look at. By the way, I'm not personally declaring these as vulnerabilities. I just what they said, but was someone having affairs? Was someone having serious financial problems? They didn't look at those, for example, as one might. They looked at who was really a homosexual. Like that was their target. They became particularly focused on this and were encouraged by work in this area in the United States. So we hope to have more scholarship done in this area to really understand, like, how did it come north? What was so compelling? Why did Canadian politicians fall for it? what was the climate? So we're going to be looking in all of that and releasing those documents to the public and encouraging scholarship in the area. So on the other question about my conflict of interest, in some ways, you know, this isn't only in Canada story. I've sued the government a bunch of times as an intervener. And they knew it, of course. But the deal was I gave absolutely everything I could as a federal public servant, neutral federal public servant. But also I said, I have a volunteer life. And I'm going to be an intervener swearing affidavits against Her Majesty the Queen in court. And I thought it was fair that I would tell them those things. And so I filed these kinds of proactive disclosures. Whether there was actually a conflict, I don't know. It's my, you know, I could certainly participate in these things, but they're also my employer. And I think I just didn't want to be fired a second time. So, you know, I decided to keep my nose as clean as possible. I was very respectful to them and frankly grateful to continue to find a way to serve, as I'd love to, in the federal government. So, yeah, one day I'll actually look at that conflict of interest declaration, because I think it must be quite a pile of paper.
Yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was very moved, and I do want to say thank you sincerely to you and to Madame Roy for your bravery and for paving the way for people like me to go forward and have opportunities that were denied you.
Thank you.
I guess my question for you is, what kind of positive changes have you seen over the course of your career? And perhaps you could speak also to what made you want to stay with the federal government even after they treated you so badly. Thank you.
Thank you. It's also really nice to meet you, and thanks for your question. There have been an incredible number of positive changes, but you know, I talked about the kind of the vectors of pressure that we need to apply. None of them came easily. In many cases, they took decades to achieve. There were lots of folks who had similar circumstances to mine, but weren't the name behind the case that changed the law. So I know that, and acknowledge them, of course, that many fought without the outcome I had, and later those who experienced some justice in the class action. But if you think about it, you know, equal marriage was huge. Ending discrimination of policy was huge. We've had all of these changes in the policies and practices and laws in Canada. Bill C-16, now relating to the protection of gender identity and expression, was a really important piece of legislation. So there are many, many examples. People who can walk in the world with equality and dignity and respect under protection of law. That's a big deal. But there's still a long way to go. We know that there are lots of forms of discrimination, and certainly creating space for leaders of people of color, BIPOC people, trans people, and others, non-binary folks. You know, these folks have to be leaders, and I certainly want to create every space that I can to have those voices have platforms as well, and they do. They're amazing. So why did I stay in the government? You know, sometimes you go with what you know. And I think that happened to me. My father was a federal public servant. It was the family business in some ways. And serving in the way I did was something that's really, really important to me. And I was also lost. The first place I went back to was the place who treated me so badly. But it's what I knew. I got a job after being fired by the military as a tax collector. I went to what I knew. I applied back to the government. It maybe didn't make a lot of sense, but it's, you go to places you know. I eventually had a really, really good career and was able to advance in the government and had some amazing relationships with both my bosses and my colleagues, and I really loved finding a way to serve with integrity in that workplace, and I enjoyed it very much, actually.
Michelle, I want to ask you a question. You mentioned in the talk the settlement, and you just from the class action, and you described it as landmark, and you mentioned the money and the number of people, but that's not the only landmark dimension to it, right? So, I mean, in the torts or extra contractual obligations class that we teach and experience with our students in first year, we explore the limits of the traditional liability model, plaintiff suing defendant, defendant giving money that ostensibly tries to make the plaintiff whole. But in your case, thousands of people, not all of them surviving. So the settlement is not just about money in the normal tort sense. Can you tell people a little more some of what's built in? It's a different kind of justice, right? And
It is, and I step into this very gently because I know some real experts on this are here. But there were some very novel parts of this settlement. So there were financial payments to purge survivors, but because, as I understand it, Canadian law does not allow people who are deceased to make these kind of claims for compensation, their estates, for example. So money was symbolically set aside in an organization that's now been established as the Lgbt Purge Fund, approximately $23 million, to represent payments that would have been paid to other victims of the purge had they lived long enough to make a claim. This is profoundly important. This is the work, for example, of counsel for their innovative thinking in this area, and also to the representative plaintiffs who wanted to find a way to do some other creative things. The mandate of the LGBT Purge Fund is 4 things. It's to build the LGBTQ2+ national monument. That will be built in Ottawa, unceded Algonquin land, and it will be inaugurated in 2025. We are also collecting the historical records, a sample of which I showed you tonight, where we're gleaning some of these really key insights into what was happening in the government, and much further back as well. We're working on an exhibit with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where we'll tell the story of the purge. What happened? Where did it come from? Diving into the oral histories of survivors. And finally, we're working with the federal government. We're going to help them be a better employer, more inclusive, more sincere diversity. These kinds of things, guiding, consulting, working with them. Remember, nothing about us without us, right? So they're talking to us, and we've provided a major landmark report to them called Emerging from the Purge, where we outline steps, recommend to them ways that they can be a better employer. Oh, there is one last thing, and it might be of interest to you. We also make grants. We do that for academic fellowships. We do a number of things. For example, we've got an oral history project that we're really honored to fund. And the unwritten things that we do is that we're there as a community, right? These amazing people, purge survivors, have been just really looking to find each other. So there are new organizations sprouting up all the time to bring them together to kind of share some of the pain they've been through and say, that happened to you too? You went in that same undercover K car to your interrogation? Wow. And it's been really rewarding. So those are the things that have come from this class action lawsuit that I think are innovative and creative. And one more thing, if I can say. I'm wearing a pin tonight that only survivors of the LGBT Purge received. This went to any member who requested it and was part of the class action lawsuit. It's called the Canada Pride Citation. It was uniquely issued by the government of Canada. We're so glad and honored to wear it. It's kind of one of those pins that when people say, hey, where do I get one of those? That's a club people don't really want to be part of, but it gives us an education opportunity. And I noticed that there's at least 2 of them in this room tonight. I'm wearing one. Martine Roy is wearing hers as well.
Yeah, go, Darren.
Thank you so much for coming today and for that really inspiring speech. I was wondering if you might share, so I come from south of the border and remember quite vividly the struggles around all of these issues. And within the LGBT community, how there were some tensions within the community about how this should be prioritized and whether it should be prioritized. There were people who felt that there should be other goals of the movement rather than support people. And my feeling at the time was, and still was, that people who want to serve the public should be welcomed regardless of who they are. But I was just wondering whether you experienced something similar here and whether that history is part of what's being documented.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you raised the issue of documenting the complex history of how folks, perceived the injustice in the Canadian Armed Forces, in the federal public service, in the RCMP. It was rare, I will say, from my own experience. This was pre-social media. I think it might be a different situation today. But I really mostly received support. And I think that may not be unique to all those who experienced the purge, but I think there's a fundamental sense that this was just such an unfair thing to do. It's bald discrimination, and most people saw that, and they said that's pretty horrible. Oh my goodness, you were in the military and that happened to you? No, not Canada. And it's a veneer we have to take off because this did happen. It's this unknown history. But I think, documenting critique of why anyone would maybe want to provide that kind of service, I think it's legitimate. This is what being in an open society is about. There's perhaps criticism that could be analyzed and recorded. But that will be for others to do. What I'm interested in doing is telling the story of what really happened to people who are very good people. And it breaks my heart, I'll say, to see sometimes in some circumstances that they don't even get to march behind a banner at a pride parade. I think before people are banned, the history must be known. Assumptions need to be challenged. I'm standing up for those who experience this without question. But I do hope that in time, scholarship perhaps could be brought to this area. I think it would be really interesting. Who knows? I said we have a fund to apply to. All are welcome to apply.
I have a postdoctoral fellow who's looking at it from a remedies sense at the settlement and trying to connect it to other kinds of restorative justice models and stuff. So some of that work is already starting. Other questions? Yeah, come on down.
Oh, here. Hi. First of all, I'd just like to thank again, as someone who is trans and bisexual, it's very touching to me to hear stories like the one we heard today, and teared up a bit at sort of the the fact getting recognition for so many people that had been denied it for so long, and this respect that I think had been denied for so long, and as well this
Thank you.
taking care to record a history that goes so often unrecorded is very meaningful to me. But my question sort of have one sort of more personal and one more systemic, and I suppose choose to answer one or the other or both. On a more systemic level, I'm sort of curious, as someone who has been involved in your own lawsuit, in lawsuits as an intervener, and in the public civil service, how you see the role of different elements of government when it comes to bringing justice. And in particular, I was thinking about, of course, the court is often, by necessity, a last resort for gaining justice. We advocate, we go to the legislative branch, we talk to the civil service, et cetera, et cetera. So do you see the court's role as being confined to this last resort, or do you see it as working perhaps more harmoniously or less confrontationally with the legislature, with the civil service, with the executive in terms of bringing justice? And then the more personal question, which again just sort of touches me as a member of that community, is you mentioned initially when you were bringing your lawsuit that you said, yes, if I can be anonymous, and they explained that you couldn't be. What is it, what did you draw from for the strength to go forward despite that? Because I know for me that it's been a really difficult journey in terms of myself, even within a supportive community. And it's just amazingly striking to me having that courage, especially at that time. But thanks.
Thanks. Thank you so much for those questions and really speaking from the heart. On your last question first, I've never felt particularly courageous or brave, sincerely, okay? But I've always felt worthy. I've always felt like I had inherent dignity. And that, I think, can be a bit of a North Star to standing up, to finding the courage, digging down deep, standing proud, respecting yourself and loving yourself first. I think those are important beacons to hold on to you because they're true. They're true. You know, I'm actually, you know, I'm sure there's so many other folks better placed than me to talk about the first question about kind of when do you turn to the courts. But I know that in every kind of challenging position, sometimes the courts are that last resort that you can go to and can be more compelling than the outcome of an election. Because it's not a matter always of what the majority thinks. It's about fundamental justice principles. And, you know, this is where our beautiful Charter of Rights and Freedoms comes into play. You've always got that to turn to, another North Star. And, you know, I think accessing the courts is can be a great challenge for many, and I acknowledge that. But I've also been able to work with many lawyers who worked on a pro bono basis or otherwise to really put their heart and soul and their practice behind trying to move forward a movement to seek justice. And so it's always been amazing to me that people would work for less than they can earn on maybe a commercial basis, but to put everything into trying to bring justice for people. This is incredible that the idea, the concept of pro bono works and is so alive, so that's amazing. But really, turning to the courts and having a fair hearing is justice in itself, I think. And it takes many different avenues of pressure to make change, but the court sure can speed things up.
If I could add just on Casey's question and your answer. I mean, it's fascinating seeing the letter to the Prime Minister saying,
Right.
this is going to embarrass the government. Please follow the recommendations you've already had, because that was not the only instance in the 90s where the public service was telling the government, look,
Right.
you're way behind on the LGBT thing, and you're going to pay the price, right? So we sometimes think of government, the constitutional people talk about the courts and the judiciary and the legislature, but the government it's a very complicated beast, and it was changing at different times, I imagine, different people in different pieces, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
There were just as much as, they were saying, hey, listen, you're going to be embarrassed. I know there were others who said, if you do this, it's an abomination, right? And somebody mercifully prevailed on the right side here. And, that may be a surprise to some that it was Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, but there he was. And he was the one who approved this. And I think that history is important to realize and to document as well.
Another question. Yeah, come on down.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, do you feel like the armed forces has done enough to reconcile for the experiences of LGBTQ people during the purge and to create an environment where LGBTQ people feel welcome and safe? And I'm also wondering, do you still hear stories of people facing discrimination that maybe causes them to leave the forces? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. What's happening in the Canadian Armed Forces today, military sexual trauma, in some ways, the crisis in some senior leadership levels is pretty concerning. But I know for a fact that they are working very hard to improve that. Martine and I are frequently called upon to connect with them and to help, to hear what they're doing, to hold them account. And there are a whole bunch of people involved in that, but they are going through a very painful exercise. But are they doing enough? That is a big change management exercise, because that is entrenched, right? If you think of misogyny, of the kind of toxic masculinity, of the structural, organizational changes that need to be brought to bear there, that is a heavy lift. But they're doing it from everything I know. On the other hand, here, in this folder, to everywhere I go, is a letter of apology from former Chief of the Defense Staff, Jonathan Vance. Of course, he's now before the courts. This just reveals the complexity of the situation. At once, he is the senior military officer, of course, Chief of the Defense Staff. He is no longer in that position. I should, of course, hasten to add if you don't know. But, writing the letter of apology, sincerely, I believe, to purge survivors. That's just reveals the complexity of the circumstance. I'm not sure I have good answers, but I am working very hard with many, many, many others to try to hold them to account, to accelerate change where possible, and to keep telling the story of their history so that their current will be better and their future will be brighter.
We have time for the final question, so come on down to the microphone.
Thank you again for your very impactful discussion today. It was, just a privilege to be here tonight. I wanted to ask, I've been reflecting on what you've been saying about how you had a positive and supportive reception from those around you, and how, the letter that we saw, I think, clearly demonstrated that there was at least some kind of an understanding of what was right and what was wrong at the time. And you said that when people read your story, like they knew, like how could this be happening in the Canadian Armed Forces? It was just so overtly discriminatory. But I guess my question is, how do you think that happened? Like what structures were in place? What tradition was in place that allowed those policies to stand? And then I kind of think to issues that we're facing today that on its face, seem very overtly discriminatory to many people in our modern society. And I just wonder, what are the things that you think that we should be doing to call out those issues when there seems to be a clear right answer, and yet there's still either political space or social space for the discrimination to continue?
Thank you. I think big institutions like the military are really hard to change. They become entrenched, they become calcified, they reflect views often a generation behind them. And they did not keep up in the mid-1980s and early 1990s with where the Canadian population was and the kind of, emergence of a much more open state of mind. I think, they become really entrenched in holding on to things that might push them to be more open-minded. It threatens people. And that's probably why they didn't change. They really could demonize LGBT people. They could see us as really, really different from them. And this is pretty classic, right? They hold on to this idea that they've figured it out and their way is better. And we have to break that down. And it's happened, of course. That there's a lot still to be done. And you asked, what do you do when you see it? But I think everyone kind of knows the answer, which is speak up about it. Say, that doesn't stand, I don't stand for that. Challenge it. Form groups. I remember a young political science student speaking to me in a class and at a university, and she said, nothing matters more than climate change activism for me, but it takes so long and it's so expensive and I don't know what to do. And it was just like, don't give up easily, be in for the long haul, be unbending in your commitment, join others to help you in what you believe in, because chances are a lot of other people do as well, and keep adding to that intense form of pressure that doesn't allow others to get away with discriminatory conduct. And those are the things that you probably know innately and you're already doing. The good thing is that dreamer line I talked about, I know I'm not the only one. Of course, that would be absurd. Everyone here has the idea of working to see things better for themselves and for others. And that's how we become a more open, loving, tolerant society in my eyes.
So for a closing word and to thank our speaker, I'll turn the podium over to the Honourable Mr. Justice Alexander Pless, BA 94, BCL 98, LLB 98 of the Superior Court of Quebec. Justice Pless, I'm proud to say, is an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law.
I've been working on these remarks for a couple of days now. I thought I would get through it easily. No, I knew I wouldn't get through it easily. I thought I would get through it without showing too much emotion. It's impossible. So I was counsel for the Attorney General of Canada in the LGBT Purge file. And one of the reasons why it's so emotional for me to be here is I was in that room. And that day when we approved the settlement in the federal court, the survivors of the purge testified in support of the settlement. And you saw the incredible harm, the unspeakable harm that was done to these people in your name, by the way, in our name, in Canada's name. So it's a privilege for me to be here with you. I see Martine, I think, to say thank you for your talk today. You know, here in the faculty, of course, we celebrate lawyers a lot. We talk about their courage and their great legal battles. And I think we easily forget. In fact, not only do we forget, we barely even talk about the fact. We refer to the cases by the names of the cases, but we almost never think about the clients. And Michelle said she hadn't been courageous, but that's not true. Because there were many, many, many people, many survivors before Michelle who couldn't withstand what was necessary to stand up to the Canadian government and to the army. And nobody who hasn't been involved in litigation knows the emotional cost. It's not just saying, I'm willing to be the plaintiff. It's standing for humiliating cross-examinations. It's living the uncertainty. You might lose. You might lose and it'd be for nothing. You suffered and you got nothing. And the most extraordinary thing, when you win, what do you get? You just get to be treated like everyone else. That's it. You just get what everybody else takes for granted. So, I don't want to just thank you for the talk, but also what you've done. You, of course, share hope for all of us. You inspire people. You taught everybody here and everybody who knows your story that you can make a difference, that by standing up you can make a difference. You may remember I sent you a photo of my kids in front of your photo in Ottawa. They put up a walk of fame for heroes of the LGBT community. And of course, Michelle's a hero. And I got to tell my kids that I knew her, that we'd worked together. I think they were proud of me. I know because you're a hero, you make it easier for a kid to come out. So, saying thank you is not enough. Right? We can't be here and not say what I know a lot of people asked in their questions. You should never have had to go through this. my memory serves correctly, you were released in '89. The government didn't back down for, you filed your complaint, 3 years of litigation. This was not 1950, okay? This was not 1950. This was the 1990s. Sure, eventually the government did the right thing. But we're talking 20 years after Prime Minister Trudeau had said the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation, and in 1969, the partial repeal of the criminalization of homosexuality in Canada. Charter was adopted in 1982. Section 15 came into force in 1985. The government had done these reviews. I talked about it. And it took that long. She had to fight. She didn't want to put her name on the procedures. She still had to fight. And it's happened because people failed to do the right thing. And some of the last question that was asked is, how did that happen? I spent my whole career in the government as a government lawyer. I chose to be a government lawyer because I wanted to serve, like Michelle. You know, victims should not travel along the road of becoming survivors alone. People have to stand up. Allies have a duty to act, right? Allies have a duty to act. Can't just be the people who are harmed, who are the victims of injustice. The people around who see it. That's one of the amazing things, is how many people would say it at the time. But the people who had decision-making authority didn't have the courage to act. And one of the most, I would say, sad lessons of the life that I had as a litigator and as a judge is that the adversarial context of litigation absolutely normalizes opposition. You file a complaint, and the first thing is not, is she right? It's, how can we say no? And then you move into this process, and there's a habit. Can't discuss it, it's before the courts. It doesn't have to be that way at all. And I think it's important to remind everybody that Michelle shouldn't have gone through this. It would have been easy to do the right thing. It would have been easy to do the right thing. It didn't have to take so long. It would have been easy. It was just easier to do the wrong thing. So I want to say thank you. Thank you. But I hope that one of the lessons is not just the history lesson, but it inspires you all to stand up when you know what is right, to do something about it. Because sometimes doing the right thing is actually not that hard. It just requires you to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here this evening. Please come back soon to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and McGill Faculty of Law. Go safely tonight. We'll see you soon.